Hi guys, if you're checking this video out, this is a second episode of an ongoing series of videos where I discuss the quality of He-Man writing. So please first check out the video, What Makes a Good He-Man Episode, before diving into this one. Also, fair warning, this video is a bit more analytical and might not be as funny as the previous video, so just in case, if you didn't enjoy the previous video, you might not enjoy this one. Also, it's gonna have a lot of pie charts. Okay, there's a phrase I throw around occasionally when I like a certain movie, for instance, where I say that it's well-rounded. But what does that phrase even mean? Well-rounded? Well, it might mean different things for different people, but I tend to think of it as a pie chart where the essential elements of what made the movie enjoyable are more or less in balance. But I think that's giving a slightly simplistic interpretation because I guess you could see these as trilemmas. Okay, I'm throwing out a lot of phrases, so let's approach this on a more show-and-tell style. So the three things which really comprise a He-Man episode in my view are A, plot and character development, B, the comedy, and C, the action scenes. I can guarantee you that you can take literally any He-Man episode and pie chart it according to these three categories. So does the perfect He-Man episode have 1/3 of all of these? No, of course not. You know me, my favorite episode is The Reign of the Monster. And I would argue that episode is comprised of 90% of action and exposition, with a comedy quota of about 10%. But then I also like the episode The Search for the VHO, where it's roughly the same proportions action and comedy, with the story exposition taking up 10 or so percent of the whole episode. And how about It's Not My Fault, which is almost 50% action scenes, 50% story, and 100% boredom. Okay, you might be already getting the image that these proportions aren't exact and that there's obviously some overlap. You see, this is why I think it's not useful to think of things in those trilemma diagrams, because this approach quickly gives you the false impression that an action or plot-heavy episode is automatically going to be low on comedy. I'm about to prove to you that's not the case, and in the case of It's Not My Fault, when I say it's 50-50 for story and action, it's really more like 20-20, and 60% is just a whole bunch of nothing. Okay, let's go look at the two episodes which roughly at least follow the division of 1/3 of action, story, and comedy. Evelyn's plot and Here There Skeletors Everywhere. Now for Evelyn's plot, you can see the action scenes very clearly. There's a rather extensive one when Skeletor and company attack the Witch's Fortress, when He-Man and Skeletor fight in the caves, and I would also count the moment when Evelyn runs off with the Cordite as one as well. The comedy is a bit difficult to measure since it happens mostly around the discussion scenes, but there's Laura pouring grease on the walls, all the widgets taking the piss out of each other, Skeletor yelling at his lackeys, and there's also a funny end note to the episode. And everything else is pretty much story. In Here There Skeletors Everywhere, we have the dual plot elements of Duncan building a machine that makes miniature duplicates, and the Bear family looking for It's a very slim story setup, but it does just barely take up 1/3 of the whole episode. There's the action down in the tunnels and Snake Mountain, and this episode's pretty goofy, so the comedy's easy enough to spot. Now, I think Evelyn's plot is a well-rounded episode, not excellent, but hits all the quotas to be a really enjoyable episode. You would probably expect me to say it's a comical episode because, well, it involves the widgets. But funny enough, I would argue that it's more of a story-heavy episode. The whole thing circulates around Skeletor's quest for Cordite and how he needs it to be able to fight He-Man. At the same time, there's Squinch's little subplot about being a good guard, how he gets tricked by Evil Lyn and then decides to go out to help He-Man. You could argue that the Cordite stuff bleeds a bit into the action side of things. After all, action scenes need a reason to happen, otherwise they're just pointless filler, like that orc scene in Song of Solace. And the Squinch stuff does bleed a bit into the comedy just because that's how the widgets are. But it's still a good character arc, so I would still argue that almost everything about Squinch fills up the story sector of our He-Man pie diagram. So what about Here There Skeletors Everywhere? Wouldn't this count as a comedic episode? Well, I already roughly went through the divisions, but yes, it sort of does. Because while in the other episode there's a tangible need by Skeletor, the Cordite, which will potentially help him beat He-Man, we have to take into account that in this episode Duncan made a miniature duplicate machine for reasons which baffle all reason. But the episode works regardless. Why does it work? Well, it comes down to that thing I keep going on and on about, the premise. The premise of Evelyn's plot is fairly serious, and therefore you tend to take the stakes seriously. The premise of Here, There, Skeletors Everywhere, as if you couldn't tell from the title, is silly, and therefore you expect the episode to be silly. And it definitely doesn't disappoint. Now, if you ever had to take an analytical look at, well, anything, you've probably been warned in the past by someone older and wiser than you that it's dangerous to assume the intent of the writers because it tends to lead to a very colored interpretation of what's actually in front of you. But having that initial assumption, even if it is wrong, is helpful in this case. So yes, making an episode with exact 1/3 ratios would probably produce a well-rounded episode, but it won't necessarily produce an outstanding episode. And the premise also probably very directly affects these ratios. You can have a very narrative-heavy episode which just isn't a whole much fun to watch because there's not enough action or comedy. Or a plot-heavy episode with a lot of action, but which makes no sense, and therefore there's really no stakes. In the end, if you can't shoot for a story that is excellent in at least one area, you should at least shoot for a well-rounded episode that has a bit of everything. And don't just write barely an outline and then fill up the remaining 5 minutes with characters running. Until next time, I have the power, so can you.